On today's show, we find out some of the biggest what ifs in Niner history. We'll also get into why we don't think Kinlaw will be back and how Steve Wilks will bring some change-ups to the 49ers defense. Remember, as always, you can listen to the episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast from. You're inside the Johnny Dell Football Academy. Hello, Niner faithful, and welcome to the Johnny Dell Football Academy podcast on the channel that's trying to answer the whys and hows of the game. As always, I am Adam Marino, joined by Mr. Johnny Dell. What's going on, man? How was your weekend?
Weekend was good, man. Just ready to dive in some stuff. We've been seeing some different reports floating around. It's the off season. Speculation time is starting to pick up. So a lot of things to think about.
For sure. I noticed just a bunch of stories on Kinlaw, so let's just get into it. We kind of were to speculate even before these stories came out based on not his ability to play the game and play in the trenches, right? But his ability to be on the field. Is that your take then as well?
Yeah, I think it's probably about 80% inability to be on the field, or not being available. When you look at it, it's like he's only played 19 out of 60 games possible to be played, including playoffs, and those aren't good numbers when you're only available 33% of the time. That's not good. And we have to understand how these fifth year options work, that once a team picks them up, they are fully guaranteed.
Yeah.
There's no possibility to release somebody. There's no way, if they get injured, you are on the hook for the entire amount, and it's a fully guaranteed 1 year salary. So there's no ability outside of an extension to kick any cap room down the road on that. And for Kinlaw, because of his inability to be on the field, he's staring at about 10 million, a little over 10 million in a 1 year contract as a fifth year option. And that is for the NFL has different tiers for things. If somebody, like, for example, makes the Pro Bowl 2 times in their first year, they're going to be in tier one, and they have different benchmarks for, or slots for, different positions. If they make one Pro Bowl, if they start all their games. Kinlaw is in one that he has started less than 50% of the games, and so he's in that tier, and it's still $10 million for a year. The 49ers have to consider not necessarily that they're going to be moving on from him. It's that, what is the market value of his contract going to be? Even if he has an absolute breakout season, then but his market value will still be affected by the fact that he has missed so much time. There's going to be fewer teams that he's not going to be getting that guaranteed money that teams would shell out. Now, he may get a large contract or a large incentive laden contract. That is possible if he has that breakout year, but he hasn't been able to prove in any way, shape, or form that he can stay on the field. That will You're not going to find many teams out there, especially in continued cash strapped years, that teams are going to be giving out big guaranteed monies to guys with very long injury histories. That makes you wonder what Jimmy Garoppolo's market value is going to be. I think his will be a little bit higher, just because of the rarity of a starting caliber quarterback in the league, and a guy who can be a top 15 or so quarterback in the league. That will drive his market value up, even with the injury history. I think some of that also comes into play, that teams will start to factor in what is San Francisco's quarterback injury history, period. We like to say it's just Jimmy Garoppolo that's been injury prone his whole season, or his whole career. But you look at every single quarterback since Brian Hoyer has gotten injured. And, so is it all just Jimmy Garoppolo, or is there something with the 49ers training staff? Is there something with, the way that we're blocking things up? I don't want to believe that. I don't see a lot of evidence for that on film. I know people will go after Kyle for, is he getting his quarterbacks hurt? I don't think he's getting his quarterbacks hurt, but it may be more of an instance of that we tend to favor run blockers over pass blockers. Most of our quarterbacks are getting hurt on drop back passes. That's just the facts. And yes, I know we had Tyler Croft blocking Hassan Reddick, and it's not an offensive lineman, but still, uh, Brock Purdy was hurt with an oblique injury on a play that wasn't Hassan or Tyler Croft blocking Hassan Reddick. So, you know, I haven't been a huge fan of how of always constantly saying if a guy's a really good run blocker, we'll overlook his pass blocking deficiencies. I think it is becoming harder in today's college atmosphere to get guys out of college that are premier pass blockers because of the way the college game has been going. There's not a lot of just drop back passing. So I think that makes it harder to adjust to that as far as picking up those premier guys. But we've also seen the way the Chiefs built their offensive line, that they went out and they completely rebuilt their offensive line with some of the best drop back pass blocking linemen that are in the game today. And they were able to protect Patrick Mahomes on one foot, and they won a Super Bowl. So I understand they play a different style. I'm not saying we become the Chiefs and air it out all the time. It's just there's something to be said of when you have a premier pass blocking offensive line. I think you have fewer injuries at quarterback. I know that's a rabbit trail. We're on Javon Kinlaw, but I just don't think that guaranteed cash, you want to give $10 million to a guy who you can only ostensibly count on being there a third of the time.
Yeah, I don't see before these stories come out, like we said, we had kind of mentioned this, that it just doesn't look good for him. And it's tough because you have actually drawn up film that shows he's taken on two blockers, he's causing sacks, he is causing stoppage in the backfield on running plays, be not him making the play, but because he does his assignment and takes on two people that Warner or Bosa or whoever it is able to make the play. And there's so many times that you see that, and it's like, man, it sure be nice if he could actually be on the field. And it's just simply not the case. And you just say to yourself, what if? What if he was healthy? What if?
Yeah.
And so it's just really tough.
Yeah. And for the most part, and it's interesting. Earlier in the year, and when he kinda came back, he was showing a little bit stronger. His performance in the NFC Championship game was not one that you really wanna put on tape. Um, he was getting blown around by Landon Dickerson, which was, I mean, it's not terribly surprising considering how much of a beast Dickerson is. I mean, that's a big man, but we're also talking about what, the ninth pick in the draft with Kinlaw. Um, I can't, excuse me if I'm a little bit off on that. I can't remember exactly where he was drafted. But he was a high first round pick, right? This was a guy that we were trying to replace DeForest Buckner with. Okay. He was getting just ejected out of his gaps in the NFC Championship game. Now I know they were on the field a lot. Some of this was before he was on the field a lot. That was
Right.
probably the worst showing on film I'd ever seen from Kinlaw, and it was not good in any way. I mean, he was getting blown out of his gaps. That's a really bad way to end the season as far as the tape you put out there. So if he was in that NFC Championship game and his film was spotless, I think they might be looking at it with a little bit different of, well, maybe we do pick up his option. When you have the mix of the lack of availability and then the last game, people always say you're only as good as your last game. When your last game that you put on film is really, really bad. I mean, we're talking not even backup level quality as what he put on film. That's that's concerning. And it's not like he had the excuse of, well, I'm tired and worn down from the entire season. He was in rehab on temporary IR for like 2 months. So I don't know. He's a big question mark right now, and you just can't give guaranteed cash to a huge question mark. It's, I think, doubly frustrating for 49ers fans as you see that the formula for success is loading up on talent on your lines, defensive line and offensive line. And when you decide to go defensive line and you've invested two very high first round picks into the defensive line, and we obviously all know how Solomon Thomas didn't work out, And I mean, I felt like he was a decent player, but he was not the number 3 overall pick in the draft. I think that's the biggest problem that most people have with the Solomon Thomas pick is he was a guy that really was probably a 3rd round talent, and you're picking him at number 3 overall. Javon Kinlaw, you have to start wondering right now, is this more of a 2nd or 3rd round talent? Is it a guy that, plus the injury history, not where he was, and you've now got 2 very high first round picks invested in the defensive line. You should be getting a Nick Bosa type player, a Deron Payne kind of player. You should be getting, that kind of production when you're talking about as high of a draft slot as these guys have had, and they just have not shown that. You should be getting a DeForest Buckner type player. Okay. We are not. And that's what's frustrating. And it makes it really hard to have sustainable success when you have consistently high first round picks that are not performing. We're looking at Solomon Thomas. We're looking at Reuben Foster. We're looking at uh, Javon Kinlaw. We're looking at, is Mike McGlinchey going to stick around? He's been good. Is he really that first round? And he was a pretty high first round pick too. Are these first rounders really performing where we want them to be? We have 3 first round picks in Trey Lance, and he hasn't been able to be on the field. It starts to make you frustrated as fans of where we're going with these first round picks. You look at them, and you got Brandon Ayuk, which it has been a very good player. Uh, I'm still not 100% sold that he's been performing to where his draft slot is. I think, and that's, I'm not trying to knock Brandon Ayuk. I love Brandon Ayuk. We're talking about a first round pick. I'm seeing more of that high second. I mean, which he was at the end of the first round, so I can say, I guess you could say that I get that positioning, but you're looking at, Nick Bosa is like the first round pick that is really performing as the first round pick. Uh, he was also the most can't miss pick, I think, coming out of that draft. And it's almost ironic with the way you've seen the injury history of Javon Kinlaw, that the big question mark coming out from Nick Bosa was, could he stay healthy? Was his injury history a concern? And yeah, we lost him with a year with the ACL, but you look at outside of that, he has been as tough as it gets, and a guy that's there available all the time. You know, we're not talking that much of a difference as far as draft slot between Nick Bosa to Javon Kinlaw. We need to be getting that kind of production, and that's why they're not going to pick up his 5th round or his 5th year option. I just don't see it.
Yeah, I don't I don't see it either. I did look it up, and he was drafted top 15. So he was number 14 in the
Okay,
2020
yeah.
draft. He's only 25 years old. But it just doesn't look like it's going to pan out with us. I mean, if he can get on track and get on somewhere, I don't know if D'Amico has a use for him in Houston. I'd like to see him still do well, but I don't think it's going to be with us. And so we talk about a lot of what ifs, and so it got us thinking just in our Niner history of some. Now there's some pretty softballs we can throw to you. What if, um what if Kyle Williams doesn't fumble the punt? What if Jim Burt does not hit Montana? What if we get someone to block that guy? Things like that are like some of the obvious ones, but what are some what ifs in our franchise's history that come to mind that could change the course of our history?
Well, I think if we're looking at softball ones, I think that's why they're in the conversation, though, right? I mean, it's not the inobvious softballs that are, ones that aren't your biggest what ifs, because they're not as clear and it's not as obvious. And so if we're looking at what are some of the biggest what ifs in 49ers history, I think that Kyle Williams fumble has to be at least an honorable mention, because it wasn't like we were guaranteed to win that NFC Championship game if he doesn't fumble. I think all of us, have for so long just assumed that if he doesn't fumble, we win that game. And then because that team, the Giants, then go on and defeat the Patriots in the Super Bowl, that we win the Super Bowl. So it feels like a lost Super Bowl. The problem with that is that we have to remember our offense was putrid in that 2011 NFC Championship game. Michael Crabtree had 1 catch for 3 yards. We had Brett Swain as one of our starting receivers who had literally just been with the team for 2 or 3 weeks, I think, was when that happened. We had Vernon Davis and Delaney Walker, but we didn't have any sort of passing attack from our wide receivers. This was before we got Anquan Bolden. And that New York defense was legit. And so, even if he doesn't fumble, we still only have the ball at like the 35-yard line, 30-yard line. We still got to move the ball 50, 60 yards to get into field goal range. So, do we get into field goal range? Do we have to punt? We don't know the outcome of that game. That's so to me, I think you okay, yeah, that could be a big what if, but it's not the biggest because there was still so much that wasn't left unanswered. Uh,
What about Roger Craig's fumble?
that's what I was just about to say.
There
I,
you
I
go.
think I think one of the bigger ones is going to be Roger Craig's fumble because that you win that game if he doesn't fumble that ball. I mean,
That's what's tough. Yeah.
and that team almost surely is going to go win the Super Bowl, and you're going to three-peat, and with something that's never been done in NFL history. That one, that one's tough, and you wonder, is Steve Young's career a little bit different if that happens? Because remember, this is happening in a time when Steve would have been leading the team for a Super Bowl, so. I think there's people who still today are still very bitter about Roger Craig's fumble. I think that's a big what if. I think the big what if is what if Jim Harbaugh decides to run the ball 3 times inside the 5-yard line in the Super Bowl.
Yeah. I definitely put that in my mind of running game in the 2 Super Bowls that we've lost in our recent history. What just simply play calling. I just have,
Yeah.
if we run the ball with Gore, if we run the ball once we realized that the Ravens were keying on Kaepernick taking away him whether he handed it off or not, they were making a statement saying, "We're gonna crush Kaepernick as much as we can, and our defense will be, well, we thought he had the ball." If that's what they're gonna do, but that means feed Gore more. And
Well, and some of that there at the goal line was they were gonna force him and Greg Roman into having quick answers. They dialed up the pressure to 11. They were like Spinal Tap. They turned it all the way up to 11 and said, "You're gonna have to beat us with accurate throws, quick accurate throws with quick decision making and quick answers." Those were things that both Greg Roman and Colin Kaepernick were not great at. And you just wonder, I mean, maybe they get stuffed 3 times, maybe they don't. Maybe Frank Gore wills his way across the goal line. What happens? Now, again, there was still like a minute 20, minute 30 left in the game. Uh, we hadn't been able to stop the Ravens much. Do they still come back? That's a big what if. It's a big what if. What if we decide to run the ball 3 times with Frank Gore? What if Jimmy Garoppolo hits that post? Uh, what if Nick Bosa, draws the holding call?
the obvious.
That to me is maybe the biggest what if. What if they get the holding call there on 3rd and 15? Because it was a 10-point lead at that time.
Right.
And they were only given they got the touchdown later again because that completion leads to then a big pass interference penalty on Tarvarius Moore down on the goal line on Kelsey. And so that's a big what if. Do we
Yeah.
have a Super Bowl there? I think I'm going to go to one that maybe we don't always jump to. I'm going to rewind the clock a little bit back and say, what if Deion Sanders doesn't sign with Dallas? And what if Deion Sanders stays with the 49ers throughout the 90s?
Wow, yeah. Because the biggest thing about that is not just Dion's performance on the field and the way that he sucked up half the field, but the attraction that he was, and now you get guys to also stay and attract even other people, to want to come play. And so it's like that factors in as well.
Yeah. I mean, because you look at that 95 team, that was a very talented 95 team, and you look at the defensive line of the 1995 team, I mean, they were stacked, and what happens if you have maybe the greatest corner ever still on your team in 1995? I mean, he goes to Dallas in 95, they win the Super Bowl. So, that's a big what if to me. I mean, because you think about what if you have Dion in 98 in in those games, and you have somebody to match up with Randy Moss against the Vikings in the divisional round, even after Garrison Hurst breaks his ankle. What if?
That's a what if. How about
Right,
that?
right. So, well, and so that's where I look at that. What if Garrison Hurst doesn't break his ankle in three places in that game? And I
Against
mean, because
Atlanta, was it?
uh, I I thought it was against Minnesota because it was in the dome.
Oh, it was against Atlanta that we didn't have him then. Or
No,
you're
he
saying in
he
that
broke
game?
his ankle in the first quarter, and because I still remember that picture from there, of his ankle just turned around the wrong way.
Right, right.
Ugh.
Oh gosh,
Um,
yeah. See, I
but
thought that was Jamal Anderson and the Dirty Bird. I thought that was when they went to the Super
my
Bowl.
well, the Falcons did go to the Super Bowl. They beat the Vikings in the NFC Championship game. The Falcons went off to the Super Bowl. And then they got beat by the Broncos. But
Right, right.
then, it's just the it's early in the morning, folks. We haven't had our coffee all the way, so I just wonder
Comment,
about some of those.
leave the
Yeah,
comments.
yeah.
This is where the
Uh,
comments hopefully blow up. We love interacting and seeing like what ones we didn't think about. One thing I have to mention as well is a lot of people, a lot of older fans will say Roger Craig. A lot of fans, and we were just so little and so young at that point. But I think for us, our generation, that game is, you have to think based on what the score was and all things considered, that if Jaquiski Tart catches the interception based on how the game was going, it's hard. I mean, again, because we still have to, you know, uh, who's to say what would happen if we have the offense on the field right there then at that time. But based on what the score was, based on how the game was going, you like to think, because you mentioned with the Kyle Williams fumble, based on where we would have had the ball and still needing to drive, things like that. It's like almost the same thing with Jaquiski Tart, but I just feel like the tide turns and we win that game, you know?
well, that and you also got to remember where Jaquaski was. There was like nobody around to tackle him if he catches that. That thing's going to be returned to the 35, 30-yard line. You're in field
That's
goal
true.
range.
Yeah, that's
And it
true.
was a 6-point game. You now make you even just run the ball 3 times. If that's even all you get, if you get one first down, you're now bleeding the clock down to 5 minutes or so, and you have a 2-possession lead. You have a 2-score game. That's a huge difference. Yes, we
Right.
can say, there was 9 minutes left, and this doesn't guarantee a win, but you go, yeah, but it was a punt. There was nobody around to tackle him. He's getting that ball back into field goal range. The offense doesn't have to move the ball into scoring position. Then you can just run out you can still bleed clock, and you can do things. And then, the way that the game was going, as we say, LA wasn't having a quick score offense in that game. That was one reason that ball was launched down there. That was a game they were running 16, 17 play drives to score.
Yeah.
When you have a 2-possession lead, and you're forcing the other team to have a 16 and 17 play drive to score, that's a huge advantage. And so, yeah, what if Jaquaski catches that punt? It almost feels like we're in the business of misery here, just thinking back through some of the biggest what ifs, because you do wonder, what if Joe doesn't get wrecked and he's there? What is the latter half of the 90s look like? Because do you have Steve Young around still by the time that Joe moves on? What if Aeneas Williams doesn't just decimate Steve Young in 1999? What if? Do we get Steve Young to 2001? Do we get him to 2002? Do we get some of the teams? If he's there in some of those teams that we had, what happens? Um, Man, there's a lot of what ifs. You feel like that we've been a franchise that for the last 25 years has missed out on about 5 Super Bowls. Um, but that's part of the game, right? Is that you have to have everything lined up just right to actually win the big game. So, to me, if it was the single biggest what if, I say Deion Sanders. Just because
Wow.
of adding, yes, we're talking about an individual title with all these other what ifs. The Deion Sanders one, I think you get at least 2 titles. I think he elevates the 95 and 96 team at least. And even you can look at the 97 and 98 team. You have those 4 teams were all highly talented teams. I think you
Yeah.
put Deion on any one of those teams and they're a Super Bowl team. So you put him on all 4, I don't know. I mean, we're talking, uh, are we talking about Steve Young as the GOAT, as the guy who's won 5 Super Bowls, who's done a three-peat, a four-peat? I just wonder, and that's gonna be my biggest what if. What if Dion stays with that team? Because it not only gives the 49ers a huge weapon on defense, it takes a huge weapon away from Dallas. So
Right, right.
that's my biggest what if.
My biggest what if is more of an absolute because they still have to go through the regular season and injuries could happen. My absolute is they complete that pass to George Kittle while we're up 10 and make a first down. And now we keep rolling and at least either get a field goal or have the momentum. And I think that's more of a guaranteed Super Bowl. The other one would be if Colin Kaepernick makes a more of an obvious catchable ball because first and goal from the one, I'm sorry. Like, nah, you're not. I don't care if it's Ray Lewis or Ditka or Hurricane Ditka. It like no one is stopping that first and goal from the one with the amount of time that we have. That's like a guaranteed Super Bowl. We win. So it's a tie between if Kaepernick throws the ball 3 feet, closer, or if Jimmy throws it to Kittle on that second down throw. Like that's just it's because it's more obvious. Like, yeah, well, we're already in the Super Bowl. We just needed that one little thing. But I love that take. That's very interesting because man, he was so fun to watch. So I'll end this segment on you're talking about misery. There's some positive things. What if we lost those Super Bowls and won the last two? It would be a different narrative in the lore of the 49ers. And to be honest, I hate saying that it was better to lose those two, but if you give me the option, I'd rather win all those. You know what I mean? And the last thing I'll say is there was a certain player that I thought was affected by one person, and Vernon Davis was big for us in big time games. And what if Singletary did not just completely exile him? What would have happened with Vernon Davis? Would he have been a bust? He had some big, big games for us Niner fans, and I just wonder. And he always says that, man, Singletary really changed his life. And so that was a pretty cool thing. So what if that didn't happen? So I know we were living in some misery, but there's some positives to take from that too. Like if those things didn't happen, we wouldn't have those positive endings. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think you have that. I think you have what if the 49ers don't draft Patrick Willis? Because you have to remember at the time, they had Derek Smith and they had Jamie Winborn. Jamie Winborn was coming off of a season when he led the team in tackles. It was like 140 tackles, something like that. And he was considered a fast, violent linebacker. Derek Smith was considered, the prototypical linebacker in the league. It felt like with the team that middle linebacker was not the biggest need when Patrick Willis was drafted, and he was drafted as high as he was. So what if the team doesn't decides that they're good at that position? And that's
Yeah.
one thing, if there's one thing that we can look from that era that we can say, they did really well during that time, was that they did tend to draft best player available. They didn't draft based on need. What if they don't draft Joe Staley because they had Jonas Jennings at left tackle? What if they don't draft Joe Staley and they say, well, Joe Staley's a left tackle and we're good there because we have Jonas Jennings. Jonas Jennings was a big free agent pickup. Most people forget about him. He was a big free agent signing from Buffalo to help solidify the offensive line, because that was when the team had gotten out of cap hell and they were just flush with a lot of money, and so they were giving away huge contracts. It was Jonas Jennings, and then Nate Clements was given that ridiculous contract, especially at the time. I mean, he was given the cap, I think, was $77 million, and he was given a deal that was about $10 million a year. When you're at 1/8 of the salary cap, that's a big deal. I mean,
Yeah.
for a corner, you're talking like a $35 million a year contract to a corner today, 35 to $40 million, somewhere in there. That's a huge contract. So, Jonas Jennings was there. What if they don't draft Joe Staley? What if they don't draft Patrick Willis? And they got both of them in the first in that same draft, right?
Right.
What if we don't draft Frank Gore because he's got the injury history? He had the knee problems, and we had Kevon Barlow, who was a 1,000-yard rusher, and they decide they're good at running back and they don't draft Frank Gore. What if, I think Vernon Davis was a no-brainer draft pick to pick because the dude was an athletic freak. His production at Maryland wasn't all that great, but he just tested off the charts. And so it was a situation where, yeah, they needed to get Alex Smith some help, especially as some sort of receiver. And what's better help for a young quarterback than a big, freakishly athletic tight end?
Right.
And so Vernon Davis was there. And yeah, what if Singletary doesn't kind of jerk him around a little bit and get his head screwed on straight? That's a big what if. There's a lot of there. I think those are a couple really, positive ones to look at, that the franchise could have gone in some darker directions, but they chose to make some good moves, and they got guys that work well. What if they never signed Justin Smith? I mean, I remember he was a guy in Cincinnati that was a defensive end in a 4-3 and didn't have that great of production, but he was kind of the best of that was available. I remember it was a very poor defensive end class, a free agent class that year, is what was available, and we needed defensive line help. And I remember they brought him out and flew him around the city in a helicopter and showed him everything, and then they gave him a $20 million signing bonus. Again, at the time, that was a big deal. And then he ends up getting transitioned to be a 3-4 defensive end.
Yeah.
That I mean, it would be like trying to make Nick Bosa, a less talented Nick Bosa. I hate to say that about Justin Smith, but he just is not the same talent as a Nick Bosa,
Right.
but the same sort of body type, right? He was not a big guy that you're trying to make him a 3-4 defensive end, which is really more like a defensive tackle. That was a bold move, and they did that, and it worked out great. So
Yeah, we talk about the defense and how, man, a lot of different outcomes with Deion Sanders. You said Justin Smith, Patrick Willis. I wanted to transition into our defense now a little bit with the changes that we have coming. And I also want to remind you guys to make sure that you like and follow on all of our platforms. We're on YouTube here. If you're watching us, we are on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And what it does is when you like and subscribe, it helps the channel grow, and when we grow, we can get really cool guests on the show, which is definitely the goal, to bring you more value. So make sure that you're telling your friends, guys. Really, it really helps us out so that we can help you out and provide the best show available. So let's get into the defense now. Steve Wilks and what he brings. He has been a defensive backs coach from East Tennessee to Notre Dame. you name it. And then he took over the Panthers, then he left, then he took over the Cardinals and left, went back to the Panthers, was their interim head coach. We saw some things that we liked. Why don't you get into some of those things?
Yeah, so the first thing you see with Steve Wilks is that there won't be a big change up as far as the way we run fronts. The fronts and the run fits that he has are very, very similar, if not exactly the same as what we've been running under Sala and under D'Amico Ryans. Base downs, if he's wanting to help defend against a run, you oftentimes see an under front. It's pretty common in the league, but he runs that a lot, under or over fronts, which give you a five-man surface against the run. So, that's something that the team is well versed in. A lot of times it'll be an under front with cover three on the back end. The coverage rules seem pretty similar to what we run. Uh, Coverages were pretty similar. I saw a lot of palms coverage, which is something that we've been running a lot of with D'Amico Ryans. He does run cover two a little bit differently than we do it. Usually, we will have the weak side uh, hook player in a cover two be playing in what's called the Bronco or skiff roll, where they will travel with a vertical up from the number two on the weak side. They didn't do that as much. They usually left that up. They would do other things as far as where the safeties and the corners match things on the weak side, which will be a little bit of a change. The biggest, most glaring change that you see are in the blitz packages. D'Amico Ryans blitzed very, very rarely. It was extremely rare that we would actually bring a lot of blitzes. Uh, Wilkes brings a lot more pressure. It was something like three times the amount of blitzes on as far as frequency than D'Amico Ryans. I think D'Amico Ryans is somewhere around 7 or 8%. I mean, it was really, really low. Steve Wilks it was closer around. I think it was 23% when I remember looking it up, because it was trying to look for things that might help me kind of see what I'm looking for. And I've watched 6 or 7 of Carolina's games. I've been in the process. I know I've been talking about doing the Steve Wilks video. People hang on. Videos like this are a mountain of work, because I'm not just going to be looking at the review videos. I'm watching one game, right? And if
Right.
I'm doing a scouting video on another team, I'm usually watching 3 games. I mean, watching their last 3 games. When you're watching something like Steve Wilks as his entire scheme, I'm
Yeah.
watching 16, 17 games. Okay. That takes a long time, and each one's going to take 3 or 4 hours. Plus, I've been trying to scale back a little bit on some stuff now that football season is over. Spend some more time with my kids, so it is coming. It's just it's a lot of work to get through to show it. But the biggest thing, like I said, is in the blitz packages. He does them a little bit differently than D'Amico Ryans did. So often we would see with D'Amico Ryans, where we would be bringing the linebackers up, covering over every single lineman, and the idea is that you're going to force the line to have to pick up every single person. And so there wasn't a lot of um, it was very straightforward as far as our blitzes. They were, we're going to line up this way, and then we're going to run X on the back end, no matter what the offense does. Okay. And we're going to bring certain guys, because by our alignment, we have determined where the line has to slide. It was dictating the slides and protections to the offense. Steve Wilkes is a little bit different of that now, because there's good and bad on that with D'Amico Ryans. A lot of times that was working out well, and you can also do the things he was doing because we had Fred Warner, and you could
Yeah.
trust Fred Warner to match receivers over the middle. With Wilkes, there was more about adjusting to how the offense is going to protect what you're showing. So there was the positives to that are that it gives you the ability to bring 5 and not 6 and still have the same amount of rushers and free rushers. So for example, one thing they do is he would walk up both linebackers over the center, and wherever the center slides to, whichever side, that linebacker is going to back out. Not too dissimilar from how Miami was blitzing us all those times, and they were getting those free guys coming, but they would still drop guys out. And they were doing defensive tackles. The difference
Mm.
is here, Wilkes is doing this with linebackers. So you get those better coverage guys than a defensive tackle, right? But it gives you the ability then that you're forcing the offense to have your center block no one, block grass, right?
Yeah.
So now you have the ability to bring 5 and get home with a free rusher, or bring 5 and still get one-on-ones and drop 6 into coverage, even if when the offense keeps 6 and 7 into block. That was something I saw a number of times from Wilkes, is that they would walk those guys up, and wherever the center slanted to, slid to, as far as to pick up one of those guys, they would drop the other guy back. They would drop him back. So if they slide to the left, that linebacker is going to drop out, and he's going to be able to help over the middle. They would usually play man coverage behind it, and then it was going to be that guy was a help over the middle. So, again, the positive is that you get the extra pressure. The harder thing is that it puts more pressure on your defenders to play sticky man coverage, and it gives your quarterbacks more defined coverage looks pre-snap of who's absolutely going to be on who. With D'Amico Ryans, it gave you the ability that the quarterback wasn't going to be sure, is Warner dropping out? Is he not? Who's he going to be picking up? Is Greenlaw going to be dropping out? Who's he picking up? So, one gives you a little bit better schematically, or schematic advantage as far as against the offensive line and adjusting to what the offense is doing. But it also gives the quarterbacks a little bit more defined look and defined matchups. The other one doesn't tend to get home at as much every time, and there's usually, you're bringing stunts in, and that does leave you susceptible to draw plays, to some screens. We've seen that over different times, that we were susceptible to some screens. So how does this translate over? I like a lot of the things with Wilkes. I really like D'Amico Ryans' defense. That's what I usually like to see. I like to see be able to get home with 4, keep 7 in coverage. That makes things really hard for the offense, because when you do that, you can always have a numbers advantage in the passing game against the offense. When you have 7 in coverage, you can always have 3 over 2 and 4 over 3. What that means is that you have 3 defenders over 2 receivers, and you have 4 defenders over 3 receivers. So you always have a numbers advantage in the passing game when you have 7 in coverage. If you're bringing more, that changes. So, I like that D'Amico Ryan style a little bit more. We'll see how it is with Wilkes. Maybe one thing that we did see down the stretch was sometimes our pass rush was not where it needed to be, and we needed to generate some more pressure. This might be the way, and how you can do that, but that's going to put a lot of pressure, especially when you have question marks on your slot position and your other safety. We don't know where those are going to be. So those are the biggest questions. I think I overall really do like what Wilkes ran. Generally, when he would play coverage, it looked very much like we had 7 guys in coverage, very similar coverage structures, and they played them very soundly. He didn't have the talent, in Carolina that we have here as far as well-rounded talent. They had some good players. I mean, you got Brian Burns, who's a very good player. You had J.C. Horn, who is a very good corner, but you didn't have the safeties, you didn't have the other linebackers, you didn't have the 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 speed at the backer position. You don't have a Fred Warner. So, what he does with those guys will be really interesting. And do they borrow from D'Amico Ryans' playbook? That's the biggest thing. But you'll see differences in pressure packages for sure.
I'm curious to see if any of his philosophy changes based on who he has. He has different toys, you might say, to work with. And so maybe he says, oh, I've never been able to do something like this, but Fred Warner can cover Devontae Adams. So now that means I get to do this. Or that's what I'm really interested to see based on, you know, our players are not going to the Panthers and him. He's coming to us. So if I were him, I would want to see what they're already doing and incorporate as much as I can, right? To make it an easy transition and add his little pieces. And I just wonder how that's going to look. And so I'm excited to see. He's definitely qualified. So I'm that's why I'm excited for sure.
Yeah, and that's where the similarities do show up. Okay, so an example of this would be when we're in cover 3, our will linebacker, if one common thing for teams to do is that they'll run the number 3 receiver, or slot receiver in from, sometimes it's the number 2, but they'll run them on a high crossing route. So they run anywhere from 12 to 15 yards deep over the middle to the other side of the field. That's what we would generally call the post snap number 3. So it's the player that ends up being the third receiver in from the sideline on that side that comes from that side. Okay. So he's, whether he starts out as the number 3 or he's the number 2 or even the number 1, he will end up being the number 3. By the time once he crosses over the hash, he's pretty much the number 3 or really the tackle. So,
Yeah.
the way we generally cover that is with the will linebacker. Sometimes we cover it with the Mike, if depending on what coverage we're in. That's going to be Greenlaw or Fred Warner, and they have to match that receiver across the field. That was one reason we went out and got a Quan Alexander, and we had Reuben Foster. That speed at the linebacker position. That was one thing I noticed when I watched Quan Alexander's tape when we picked him up, was that he was really good at matching the number 3 across the field from that position. And so that's why when I looked at the tape, I was like, okay, this is why we picked this guy. He's got the
Right.
ability to do that, which was absolutely paramount in Salah's coverage scheme from Pete Carroll. They had it with Bobby Wagner and and KJ Wright, that those guys could do that. So, we needed that. That's what you see from Steve Wilks too, is that they have the same sort of coverage structure in that. And so you're still gonna see Fred Warner matching some guys down there. You'll see it from Hafanga every once in a while. Same thing with when you're playing a Tampa 2. That was one thing that made made Tampa's defense really, really hard about that when Tony Dungy was there, and he came up with that Tampa 2, was that you have to have a linebacker first that can match a vertical down the middle of the field, and then you have to have your will linebacker has to be a really good tackler in open space, because he's going to have to pick up anything that is thrown short over the middle. He's going to have to tackle in space. That's really tough. That's still how Wilkes runs his defense. He had Luvu there for a while, and I remember when I watched their tape back before we played him, that I was really impressed with Luvu, and because he was being put in that role a lot whenever they were in that, and he did very, very well at it. So I see Wilkes using Greenlaw, using Warner in that same way. The only way that I see him using them differently is in those pressure packages. Other than that, I think they did play a little bit more man coverage than D'Amico Ryans did, but overall zone coverages was very, very, very similar to what D'Amico Ryans was running. How he was using the linebackers, very, very similar. So it's one that I don't think, as far as those guys' roles, it will be much different. I think that's one attraction with Wilkes, is that the scheme will be largely the same. It's just going to be in that 20% of the playbook that's a little bit different with those pressure packages.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see. I'm very excited for the preseason just to see what some of those looks are. Obviously, it's not going to be a ton because we know preseason. Those will be fun shows to do where we have to explain. You're not going to see all the. I'm already thinking of like in the future how that's going to look. So we will get into that. There'll be plenty of time for that. So guys, again, remember, please follow and tell people about this channel. Johnny does so much for the Niner community. So please share the channel. Please like and subscribe. Tell all Niner fans you know. Thank you for joining us. As always, take care of each other. And as always, go Niners.